when my wife stood in front of 200 people inside the Aurora Community Center Hall, smiling brightly, lifting an envelope, and saying, his whole life, all he ever did was push that trash cart. And the whole room laughed at my neon uniform, laughed at the 35 years I kept Denver clean so they could live comfortably. If you've ever been dismissed because of the job you do, the place you come from, or because your own family thinks they have the right to stand above you, leave it so I know you're still here with me, and tell me which city you're listening from. If you believe dignity can be buried but never erased from a human being, hit follow and turn on notifications. I genuinely appreciate and am grateful that you stayed to hear my story. That afternoon at Aurora Community Center, there was a kind of light unique to Colorado in early winter. Sunlight slipping through the big glass windows, spreading into thin honey-colored bands, warm enough to soften the cold of the room, but not enough to cover the emptiness in my chest. I stood outside the entrance for almost 5 minutes, my hand on the strap of my worn canvas bag, trying to take one deep breath before walking into the celebration I should have looked forward to after 40 years on the job. But today I arrived in my Denver Public Works sanitation uniform. The neon yellow safety shirt, the old cargo pants, the work boots still carrying a little trash dust from my morning shift. I didn't have time to go home and change. Truth is, I didn't even know if I needed to. To my family, I'm still just the old garbage man. When I pushed the door open, people clapped. My old co-workers, the faces that had shoveled snow with me in blizzards, swept leaves across the long streets from Capitol Hill down to Cherry Creek, looked at me with sincerity. They knew my years. They'd seen me work 12-hour shifts in storms that knocked down entire rows of trees. But my family's eyes were different. Linda, my wife of 33 years, stood near the small stage, wearing a navy dress I'd never seen her wear at home. Her hair curled neatly, lipstick red, and her smile was the kind that makes you feel like a stranger the moment you walk into the room. Evan and Sophie stood on either side of her. Evan crossed his arms, his eyes sliding from my work boots up to my neon shirt, pausing just long enough to confirm, yes, his father still didn't know how to dress properly. Sophie kept her gaze lowered to her phone, but the corner of her mouth lifted, the quiet kind of laugh I knew too well. A laugh born from embarrassment. I hadn't taken 2 steps before Linda lifted the microphone. "Everyone, may I have your attention?" she said, her voice smooth, too smooth. "Today we're celebrating a man who served this city for more than 3 decades. A few people clapped. I stayed still, trying to keep my face steady. Linda looked at me, dabbed her eye, a gesture I knew wasn't real, and then said the sentence I will never forget. His whole life, all he ever did was push that trash cart. A laugh burst from a table in the back. Not loud, but loud enough for others to turn. Someone lifted a phone to record, the lens lingering long enough to capture my face. I'm used to being underestimated, but being mocked in the middle of a ceremony, meant to honor me, in front of the people I worked alongside, cut deeper than any insult I'd heard on the street. Linda continued, but he pushed it very diligently. Our city stays clean because he loves his trash bin so much. Another wave of laughter. Evan leaned toward Sophie and whispered, "Mom's killing it." They snickered. I didn't respond. In my line of work, you learn a skill everyone eventually needs, staying silent when the noise isn't worth answering. Linda gestured for me to come on stage. "Come on up, Raymond." I stepped forward. The yellow lights of the community center shone on my neon shirt, making me stand out like a misplaced road sign among elegant dresses and crisp blazers. Linda leaned into the microphone. "He's not a good speaker. He didn't get much schooling. He's spent his whole life around trash cans." Some of the sanitation workers in the crowd lowered their heads. They knew exactly what that felt like, being looked down on for the work that keeps a whole city running. I opened my mouth, planning to say a few words of thanks, but Linda raised her hand slightly. signaling me to wait. She reached under the podium and pulled out an ivory envelope. Thick. "I have a gift for you," she said, her voice dropping into something gentle. The kind of gentle a person uses right before throwing a knife, afraid the blade might dirty their hands. Then, in front of 200 people in the hall, Linda lifted the envelope toward the lenses of a few TikTokers recording the moment. "This is a divorce petition." A hollow silence carved itself through the room, a sharp inhale from somewhere, a fork dropping on a plate, a child asking, "What's divorce?" Sophie covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Evan crossed his arms and nodded, pleased. I looked at the envelope, then at Linda. She leaned close to the mic, reading each word slowly, cold. "Congratulations on your freedom, Raymond. You deserve it." And right then, I heard the click of a camera in the back. Someone was filming. Someone was capturing the moment my wife handed me the greatest humiliation of my life. I stood there, saying nothing, because sometimes silence is the beginning of a storm. To understand why I could stand still in front of 200 people that day. You have to go back 35 years, to the early days when my family first started treating me with disrespect as if it were a habit. If someone asked me what changes a man, I'd say it's not the public slaps in a crowded hall. It's the quiet cuts, stretched out over years, until your skin grows numb and you don't realize when you started bleeding. I've worked in sanitation for Denver Public Works since 1988, when I was still young, strong, and believed that as long as you worked hard, life couldn't possibly turn out badly. But anyone who's lived in Colorado knows Denver is not a city that rocks you to sleep with warm sunlight. It tests you with winters cold enough that wind cuts through 2 layers of clothing and snow packs so thick onto the back of a garbage truck, it looks like ice settling over an old animal taking its final breath. On January mornings, I had to go down to the garage at 4:20, touch metal so cold it felt like my skin was being pulled off with it. One slip on ice, one metal lid snapping back at your head, and you end up in the local paper as another meaningless work accident. But I got used to it, just like I got used to people stepping aside when they saw me pushing the trash cart, even though that cart was where those families threw everything they never wanted to see again. My job wasn't easy, but it was real. It kept the city clean, kept disease from spreading, kept neighborhoods from Baker to Highland in the neatness they took for granted. But my kids, they never saw that. Evan, my oldest smart kid, loved medicine early on, but the older he got, the more he tried to avoid talking about me with his friends. I remember once, he introduced me to his girlfriend's parents in high school. "This is my dad. He's a city worker." The hesitation before city worker told me everything. That garbage man was a word he'd never willingly say. Sophie was smoother. She studied economics, graduated with honors, spoke well, and honestly, she learned from Linda how to make disrespect sound like polite conversation. Once, I overheard her at a coffee shop with a friend. "My dad is between jobs, basically unemployed." I'd worked the same job for 35 years. That day, I stood behind the door, my hands still smelling like trash from the morning shift. And for a few seconds, I felt like someone my own daughter was ashamed to mention. But the one who planted those ideas wasn't Evan, and it wasn't Sophie. It was Linda. Linda never badmouthed me loudly. She did it gently, subtly, like she was analyzing a psychological pattern. But that softness had a way of eroding you more deeply than shouting ever could. She'd lean down and whisper into the kids' ears, "Your father doesn't work hard enough. If he did, he'd be someone else by now." Or, "If your dad would study more, change a little, our life would be better." That phrase, "work hard enough," to someone in sanitation, someone who lifts trash, pushes hundreds of pounds, drives through blizzards, was a knife repeated over and over. Slowly, I began to see in all three. Of their eyes, Linda, Evan, Sophie. A soft contempt. Never spoken. Always visible. Linda introducing me as my husband who works for the city. Never saying my real job. Evan was changing the subject every time someone asked what his dad did. Sophie was looking at my uniform like it belonged to someone unlucky. I never snapped about any of it. Partly because I was used to enduring things, partly because I believed a family would eventually understand. I was wrong. Around my 25th year on the job, I started feeling a strange silence settling into my own home. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of three people talking to each other while treating me like a piece of furniture. I'd sit at the dinner table and they talked about work, school, and plans. None of them needing my input. I mentioned something from work. Sophie nodded politely. Evan texted under the table. Linda smiled thinly and changed the subject. One night, Evan said straight out, "Dad, your job isn't anything to be proud of." I looked at my son, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I'd failed. I felt like I'd taught them the wrong things. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I did what quiet men do when pushed into a corner. I started recording everything. I bought a thin brown notebook and put it in the cabinet under the sink, a place no one would look. In it, I wrote down every sentence they said. I saved every moment Linda belittled me in front of the kids, every time Evan mocked my job, every time Sophie avoided mentioning what I did for a living. I saved photos, screenshots, financial notes. I collected proof, not for revenge, but to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, not imagining things, not oversensitive. One winter night, snow piling on the roof, I looked at the notebook, now 3 times thicker, and whispered to myself, I'm not snapping. I'm just writing everything down. When Linda and the kids started looking down on me more openly, I realized the only way to keep my dignity wasn't by arguing. It was by building a foundation that one day would save my whole life. A financial foundation no one in the house knew about, no one could touch, and none of them could ever imagine I was capable of building. And that foundation began 15 years ago, on a cold Thanksgiving morning, when I worked an extra sanitation shift, the kind of day most people take off, the kind of quiet morning where you can hear the truck tires crack over fresh snow. They needed emergency staff that day. Everyone avoided it. Too cold, not worth the pay. But I signed up immediately, partly because I needed the money, partly because the idea of sitting at home doing nothing made me anxious. Holiday overtime is paid double and a half. In 3 months of back-to-back overtime shifts, I saved $15,000. The amount Linda thought I saved in a whole year. That money came from nearly 20 consecutive overtime shifts and several night shifts cold enough to split the skin on your knuckles. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't spend a single dollar. I took that money and went to see a small house in Lakewood, a 60s built place with fading grass, peeling paint, and windows that squeaked when the wind hit them. The previous owner wanted a fast sale because of a divorce. The price was $85,000. To Linda, it would have been a piece of junk not worth looking at. But to me, someone who handled garbage for a living, I understood the value of things people threw away. I put down the deposit, signed the papers, alone. No one knew, no one noticed, no one cared. I spent nights after my shifts, tired, freezing, hands still smelling like trash, repainting walls, replacing pipes, fixing outlets. The kind of things my job made me good at spotting. 3 months later, the house was clean, warm, bright, its value up nearly 50%. I rented it out for $11.50 a month, more than Linda thought I made from overtime. That was the first house. But the world isn't simple. I knew that if everything was under my personal name, one divorce or lawsuit, and Linda could take half, even though she never carried a single plank of wood into any of those houses. A co-worker in sanitation once told me, if you want to keep your houses away from divorce court, start an LLC, Ray. So I created Mile High Rentals, LLC, a limited liability company registered under my name, with a tiny Denver mailbox as its office address. Legal, clean, unquestioned. Through that company, I purchased more homes in Wheat Ridge, Aurora, and Arvada, signed lease agreements, received rental income into the LLC's separate account, and reinvested on a cycle. Every time I bought a new property, I told Linda overtime got cut, or the garbage truck needed repairs, or the shift system changed. She never doubted me, because to her I wasn't smart enough to hide anything. She believed in my supposed inferiority as if it were a fact of nature. While I was quietly building a stable financial system, Linda lived the opposite way. She spent money as it fell from the sky. Her credit card got shut down twice for maxing out. The first time, she blamed the store. The second time, she blamed hackers. But I knew better. No hacker buys 4 pairs of shoes, 2 spa packages, and a Coach bag at 15% off. I paid the debt. She didn't thank me. Sometimes she even told the kids, "Your father is like this because he has no big dreams. He lives too simply. He doesn't know how to strive for more." She said that right in the kitchen while I was holding a garbage bag. The irony of life is sometimes this: the person who doesn't make the money is the one who looks down on the one who does. Then came Evan. He called me one night. "Dad, I need $4,000 for med school applications. I know you don't have extra money, but I'm asking so you don't feel left out." People say the tone that makes a father feel like he's being granted a chance to help is the tone of someone who hasn't grown. I transferred it that night. He never asked where I got the money. 3 weeks later, Sophie called. "I need $9,000 for an advanced certification. I know things are tight for you, but you just have to sign. I'll pay it back." None of them imagined I owned 14 properties. In their eyes, I was just the old city worker who knew nothing beyond trash. But when people belittle you long enough, you learn to use silence as a weapon, as armor. By the time I turned 61, Mile High Rentals, LLC, owned 14 properties, $19,600 a month in rent, $3.8 million in asset value, clean, legal, transparent cash flow. My family didn't know a single dollar of it, and I had no desire for them to know. That afternoon, after the retirement party that turned into a public humiliation, I went home. I sat at the kitchen table, opened my laptop, and logged into the company email. A new message waited from my property manager. "Mr. Porter, the 14th house is officially leased." I read it 3 times, then leaned back in my chair. The storm they thought they created wasn't the one they needed to worry about. Mine had just begun, if most of my life had been spent enduring in silence. Then the dinner in Littleton was the moment that silence began to crack. That night, Littleton was so cold the air froze into thin clouds every time you exhaled. I drove my old pickup slowly toward the house where my family and I had once shared countless warm evenings. Evenings when the sound of my kids' laughter drowned out the smell of trash stuck to my sleeves after a shift. Now the house looked unfamiliar, not because it had a new coat of paint, but because the people inside it no longer belonged to me. Linda had called me to dinner to talk everything over after the party. Her voice on the phone was so soft, I immediately knew it wasn't the softness of affection. It was the softness of someone who'd already mapped out a plan. I stepped into the dining room. The fireplace crackled faintly, orange-gold sparks flicking against the walls, cutting the room into patches of light and shadow, like an old, silent film. Linda had arranged the table neatly, too neatly, as if she were setting a stage for the final scene of a play, long rehearsed. Evan and Sophie were already seated. Evan sat with his arms crossed, his expression a mix of impatience and coldness. Sophie held her phone, camera pointed at the table, pretending to film a food vlog, but I clearly saw the draft text on her screen. "Retirement drama. Stay tuned." I quietly sat down across from Linda. The room was so still I could hear the logs in the fireplace pop. Linda poured wine, smiled, Raymond, we need to talk, honestly. I nodded, waiting. She set her glass down, tilted her head, and asked in a voice so gentle the cruelty inside it became sharper. Do you really think you're capable of taking care of the kids and me? Evan glanced over, ready to jump in, and he didn't wait long. Dad, he said, his tone flat but loud enough to stake a position. Your career. No one would call that a career. I breathed in slowly. I was used to hearing people say that. Just not my own son. Evan kept going, as if he'd been waiting years for a chance to unload it all. I'm about to graduate from med school. All my friends' parents do something meaningful, but you... He paused, shrugged. You just pushed trash cans your whole life. How could you ever understand the pressure we're under? Sophie let out a small laugh, like she was backing him up. Then she lifted her head and said the sentence that felt like someone had shut a door behind me. We need to rethink our lives. Mom deserves better. The room suddenly felt hot, though the fireplace hadn't changed. The crackle of burning wood sounded like my heartbeat, slipping out of rhythm. Linda set down her knife, looked straight at me. Raymond, you know, you and I, we haven't shared the same goals in a long time. I want a peaceful separation. Sophie angled her phone slightly, deliberately capturing half of Linda's face mid-confession, and typed another caption. Mom deserves better, fresh start. Evan said nothing more, but his expression was clear. If Mom leaves, I'm with her. The yellow dining light fell over the table like a thin cloth. I looked at the 3 people I'd called my family, and felt as if I were seeing them through thick glass. Distant, warped, unreachable. I had so many things I could say about the overtime, the winter night shifts, the fact that I paid every bill and every credit card Linda maxed out, the 35 years I kept the city clean so others could live comfortably. But none of it mattered. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a funnel to pour all their dissatisfaction with life into. And they chose me. I set my fork down, my eyes steady. Not angry, not defensive, just silent. The kind of silence that makes the person across from you unsure whether you're breaking down or calculating. Evan frowned. Dad, are you listening? I nodded once. Then I looked at each of them slowly, as if it were the first time in my life I was seeing them without the fog of family ties. Finally I asked in a low, clear, steady voice, do you truly think I'm that incapable? In that moment, the room stopped breathing. Sophie lowered her phone 1 beat slower than normal. Evan stopped blinking. Linda bit her lower lip, the reflex of someone who suddenly realizes they'd pressed a nerve deeper than they intended. But they still didn't know that question was only the door opening before the storm arrived. Tonight, under the yellow lights of downtown, I understood that to continue telling this story, I had to go back to 2008, to the moment when everything inside me began shifting. I remember it clearly. That night, Denver was cold in the way only a high plains city can be cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but the kind that sinks in, from the outer layer of your skin all the way into your spine. Snow fell steadily, dusting the rooftops in a thin white coat, like someone had sprinkled powdered sugar over a model city. I sat inside the cab of the old garbage truck from the solid waste division, the engine humming in that long, weary rhythm, familiar after 30 years. Streetlights reflected off the windshield in wavering bands of gold, rippling with every pothole hidden under the snow. It was close to midnight, the time when the city looks the most beautiful and the most alone. I parked at the corner of 15th and Larimer, turned off the engine, and let the silence settle in. From there, I could see downtown Denver, glowing like a silk scarf draped across the sky. Republic Plaza stood tall, the bars in Lodo still shining with laughter. Young people inside were raising glasses, living a life that had no idea men like me kept their city safe and clean. I leaned back in my seat, and the memories of 2008 flooded back without asking for permission. 2008, the night I pulled an old man out of a frozen dumpster. It was a January night, so cold the ground made a faint cracking noise beneath my boots. I was collecting trash near Civic Center Park when I heard a sound from a big dumpster behind the city library. I thought it was a stray cat, but when I opened the lid, in the dim light, I saw an elderly man curled up inside, his hands purple, his breath so faint it looked like it might stop at any moment. I climbed in, pulled him out of the frozen trash, and called 911. He lived. The next day, people praised me briefly, then forgot. Only I didn't forget, because people are only visible when they die, while the ones who save them disappear the moment life returns. My job was just like that, present everywhere, seen by no one. I looked down at my hands. I couldn't even feel the cold anymore. The fingers were dry, cracked, calloused like river stones. 35 years of pushing garbage bins, hauling loads, working through blizzards, dodging needles, angry dogs, and careless drivers. Self-respect doesn't shatter in a day. It's eroded slowly by words that drip like acid. Dad's between jobs. Dad doesn't understand our pressure. Are you sure you can even provide for us? I'd let those phrases carve into me for so long that eventually I started accepting them as truth. Until tonight. Staring at the glittering city from the cab, a clarity hit me, sharp as a blade. I'm not beneath them. They just chose to place themselves above me. I wasn't useless. I wasn't incompetent. I was simply a man my family never bothered to understand. I shifted the gear to park, reached under my seat, and pulled out the canvas bag. Inside was the file for Mile High Rentals, LLC. The thing I had quietly built over the years, not to boast, but to protect myself. I spread the papers out across my lap. The LLC certificate, tax filings under my company, bank statements, the deeds to every one of my 14 houses, receipts from repairs I did myself. Every tenant contract I checked every stamp, every signature, every address, every house belonged to me. Every payment came from money I earned, and under Colorado law, all of it was legally mine. Linda didn't know. Evan didn't know. Sophie didn't know. They looked at me like trash, while I kept part of Denver clean and owned another part of it on paper. In the dark cab, the streetlight made the documents shimmer like silver foil. I stacked the papers and zipped the bag. Then I sat still. For a long time. Not because I was sad, but because in that moment I understood something. The only thing I'd been missing for 35 years was the right moment to act, and that moment was now. I turned on the lights, started the engine, the truck shaking as it woke. Snow was beginning to fall heavier, as if the sky were covering everything before a storm broke loose. I looked out toward the glowing towers of the city and said quietly, "Tomorrow, they'll find out exactly who they've been mocking." After that night in the garbage truck, I knew I wasn't looking back anymore. Memory time was over. Now it was time for the truth. The next morning, the snow had stopped, leaving only thin patches clinging to the trees like scattered white salt. Denver was so quiet, I could hear cars gliding over the damp pavement. I drove to the office of attorney Becca Hooper, a small woman with a razor-sharp mind, known across Colorado for turning messy divorces into a walk across clean snow. The sign, Hooper and Niles, Family and Property Law, gleamed faintly in the pale morning sun. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. Becca was waiting at the table, short brown hair clipped neatly behind her ear, silver-rimmed glasses raised slightly. In front of her lay an organized stack of papers. My papers. She looked up and said, "Mr. Porter, I've read everything." I sat down, set my canvas bag on the table, and waited. Becca flipped through the documents with the calm tone of someone reading the weather report. 35 years of documented separate income, overtime logs, city pay stubs, tax returns, all complete, all clean. I nodded. She moved to the next stack. 14 properties under Mile High Rentals LLC, all purchased with your income. No co-ownership, no contributions from Linda, no marital assets. She closed the folder with a quiet pop, then looked straight at me. The look of a lawyer who's seen dozens of people walk into divorce court thinking they would win, only to find out they owned nothing. She can't touch a single cent of it. I didn't smile, but something shifted in my chest. Not triumph, but a quiet confirmation that I hadn't lived my life wrong. I had worked right, I had prepared right, and now it was time to protect what I built. Becca slid a paper toward me. Raymond, the only thing Linda can try to claim is emotion. She'll paint a narrative. You were absent, you didn't care, you weren't capable. But with this file, she cannot reach your assets. I looked at the papers, and it felt like looking at myself, not the man in a neon uniform humiliated in a community hall, but the man who had stood steady, year after year. Becca asked, "How prepared are you for the meeting?" I placed my black briefcase on the table, the kind men like me rarely use unless it carries truth. I opened it. Property deeds for all 14 houses, bank statements, rent logs, 1099 tax forms, and a brown notebook, the journal I began years ago. Becca nodded, strong enough to tear apart anything Linda tries. I closed the case halfway, then paused. One thing left before the storm. I called Dennis, the LLC's property manager. Unit 11, I asked. Did they sign long-term? He replied instantly, "Yes, sir. 24 months. And they agreed to the extra 200. I thanked him and hung up. Becca watched me with a small, impressed smile. Your financial structure is cleaner than most professionals. What kept you quiet for 35 years? I smiled, not modestly, but like someone who had made himself small, so others could feel tall. Because some people, I said slowly, don't celebrate your success. They want to control it, spend it, decide for you. I didn't hide to show off later. I hid to protect what I built from the people who looked down on me. My voice dropped. If they'd known I had money, Linda would have spent it like a tornado. Evan would have used it as a crutch. Sophie would have treated it like my duty. And all three would have believed it was their right. Becca nodded slowly, understanding the anatomy of my family perfectly. I hid it, I said, eyes on the briefcase, because it was the only way to keep everything I worked for from being erased with a single signature. Becca smiled slightly. And now, it's time to open what you've kept hidden for 35 years. I didn't answer. I just placed my hand on the briefcase, as if touching the door of a room no one had ever been allowed inside. I breathed in deeply, the breath of someone stepping from shadow into light, knowing the light will bring a storm. Then I clicked the briefcase shut. The sharp sound sliced through the room like the cocking of a loaded gun. Not just a lock clicking. It was the sound of 35 years of silence finally breaking. 35 years of memories settled like dust on the floor. When I lifted my head, Linda was still standing at the center of the stage, gripping the microphone, continuing the unfinished humiliation in front of hundreds of people. As if this were her coronation, not her husband's retirement party, she raised her hand, smiling theatrically. Everyone, please keep quiet for a moment. 200 people turned to look. Their eyes flickered between curiosity and excitement, the kind of excitement a crowd feels when they think they're about to watch someone get humiliated again. Evan stepped forward, snatched the mic from his mother, twirling it like some seasoned MC. Today, my mom is finally free. His voice carried that smug tone of someone convinced he's saying something noble. A few laughs broke out in the back, the same laughs I'd heard for 35 years, from people who believed sanitation work was for those without ambition. Then came Sophie's turn. She smoothed her hair, angled her phone to catch her best side while her live stream captured everything. We're proud of Mom for leaving someone with no future. Every word she emphasized cut like a small blade. Some people in the crowd frowned, but many others lifted their phones to record. The blue LED lights flashed like rows of emotionless eyes. I looked at my daughter, the child I once held the day she was born. Now she was live streaming the public humiliation of her own father for views. A young guy whispered nearby, "This is peak TikTok drama, man." I heard it all, clearly. Linda stepped forward, holding out the gold envelope like a gift. "Raymond, congratulations on your freedom. You deserve it." The entire hall held its breath. I stood, pushed my chair back so gently that the scrape of its legs echoed louder than the applause she'd gotten earlier. I stepped to the center of the stage, my hands steady, my voice steady. "If everyone wants public honesty," I said, "I'll give you the truth." The room rippled. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, the same phone they always assumed I only used to call the waste management supervisor. "Linda, I think you should be the first to hear this." I unlocked the screen, opened a folder I'd labeled gently, "Just in case." The LED screen behind us cast a cold light across Linda's now pale face. I'd started collecting everything years ago, not for revenge, but to remind myself I wasn't imagining the way things were. "This," I said, "is your gym schedule with trainer Brock. 62 sessions in 3 months. Nothing wrong with personal training. Lots of people do it." A wave of whispers swept across the room like fire catching dry grass. "But this," I swiped right. Messages, timestamps, locations, content, all of it. "Come after he falls asleep. Keys under the doormat like before." Sophie's jaw dropped. Evan's knuckles went white around the mic. I wasn't finished. "Here's the security camera I installed by the back door. The one you thought I never checked." A video played. Linda opening the door. Brock stepping in, his hands sliding onto her waist. A collective gasp burst across the hall, like someone had slammed a sheet of metal. "And here," I opened Linda's GPS logs. 48 trips to the same location, a cheap motel in Glendale. Linda wasn't breathing normally anymore. Sophie shut off her live stream in a panic. Evan backed up half a step. I looked Linda in the eyes. "You said you wanted freedom?" My voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Fine, but don't lie about the reason." I took a step closer. "You're not leaving me. You're just running after someone else." The hall fell into a dense silence, the kind of silence only the truth can create when it rips the air open. I lifted my head, staring into hundreds of eyes, waiting for the final blow. As the whispers after the motel video hadn't even died down, I set the black briefcase onto the table at the center of the stage. In that moment, I could feel the entire Aurora Community Center, all 200 people who had watched Linda humiliate me, collectively hold their breath, as if some instinct warned them that whatever was coming next wouldn't be anything like the cheap family drama they were expecting. I pressed the 2 metal latches. The sharp click rang out like a blade tapping steel. Linda staggered, bracing herself against the podium. Evan's eyes widened. His lips trembled as if he'd just watched his father become someone he never knew existed. Sophie stood frozen, her phone still in her hand, though the live stream had died somewhere amid the chaos. I opened the case, lifted the first stack of documents, and held it up so that overhead lights illuminated every detail. "These are my property deeds. 14 houses, 14 titles, 14 assets in my name alone." A wave of gasps broke through the crowd, no longer mocking but stunned, the sound of people realizing they had misjudged someone their entire lives. I went on, my voice steady, each word dropping like a cast-iron weight. "Current market value, $3.8 million. Linda wavered, her face draining so fast I thought she might collapse right there. I pulled out the next stack. Rental income per month, $19,600. From the middle rows, a man in a navy jacket suddenly shot to his feet, pointing at me, shouting, "Ray, you're my landlord!" The room erupted, not in laughter, but in shock, so big they couldn't swallow it fast enough. People whipped their heads toward each other. I rent Unit 7 from him. No way. Wait. 3100 Wadsworth. That's his place. Evan stepped forward half a step, his face ashen, drained as if someone had pulled the plug on him. He stammered, all arrogance gone. No. No way. Dad, you're just a city sanitation worker. How do you have that kind of money? I turned to him, the same son who once borrowed $4,000 from me, who said to my face that my job wasn't a real career. I answered calmly, but the words sliced through the room like a clean strike across stone. Pushing a trash cart doesn't mean I don't know how to use my mind. Someone in the crowd let out a sharp breath. Another whispered, "Oh my God." Linda clawed at the edge of a chair, gripping so hard the tendons in her hands stood out. "Ray, you hid this from me?" she asked, her voice shaking like someone thrown into icy water. I answered without anger, without vengeance, only the truth built from 35 years of being dismissed. I hid it, not to get back at you, but to protect what I built with these calloused hands from your contempt. Linda slumped into the seat. Evan took a step back. Sophie couldn't lift her head, and I looked out at the faces that had once seen me as a failure, now staring at me like they had just witnessed a quiet, total overthrow. The atmosphere in the hall, after that brutal financial twist, felt like the sky right before thunder hits, so silent you could hear another person's heartbeat, yet so tight that a single breath might shatter the room into pieces. And then, the thing Linda, Evan, and Sophie never imagined possible began. A chair scraped lightly on the left side. A middle-aged woman stood, hands clasped together, her voice trembling but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Raymond, I misjudged you. I'm sorry. I thought your job was beneath people. I was wrong." Then another person rose. "Me too. I used to tell my kids to avoid sanitation work, but today, I'm ashamed of myself." An older man touched his chest and nodded at me. "I thought you were just the guy pushing the trash cart. I didn't know you'd kept our whole neighborhood clean for decades." Each confession landed like dust being wiped off my dignity. Dignity my family had rubbed down to nothing for 30 years without ever realizing it was worth more than anything in their wallets. Then a voice rose above them all. From the back of the room, a man in a red Denver Sanitation Union jacket walked forward. I recognized him instantly. Marcus Hill, union rep, and the guy who worked my shift in 2011. He took the mic, looked at Linda, then straight at Evan and Sophie. "I want everyone here to know exactly what kind of man Raymond Porter is." He stopped, drew a breath. "During the 2011 blizzard, when the temperature dropped to 20 below, one of our trucks flipped on I-70. One of our guys got his leg trapped under the frame. Nobody dared go near because the truck could slide again any second." Marcus turned to me. But Raymond ran toward it. He dug through the snow with his bare hands, pulled the steel frame up, and held our co-worker's head away from the metal so he wouldn't crack his skull. If it weren't for him, that man would have frozen to death. A louder gasp erupted, this time not shock, but respect. Marcus faced the hall. He never told anyone, never bragged, never posted about it. He didn't even tell his own family. Then to Linda, slow, deliberate. "A man like that deserves far more respect than he's been given." Linda bowed her head. Evan and Sophie stood frozen like two people slapped with the truth. The crowd shifted, clearly. They split into two currents, one flowing toward me, the other pulling away from Linda like she was toxic. A young woman beside Sophie leaned to her friend and whispered just loud enough, "God, how could her kids treat their father like that?" Sophie's eyes collapsed, tears rushing out like a dam finally bursting from years of quiet guilt. She stepped half a pace toward me, her voice cracking apart. "Dad, we didn't know. We really didn't know." Evan, trembling under the weight of the truth, tried to speak but choked on the words. "Dad, we didn't know. We really didn't know." I looked at them, not with gloating, not with softness, with truth. The truth I'd spoken my whole life, the truth no one ever listened to. I answered slowly, clearly, laying each word like bricks to rebuild the foundation of my own family. Respect begins with listening. I turned to Evan. You never listened to your father? Then to Sophie. And neither did you. Neither of them could look up. Linda sat gripping the edge of her chair, her face drained of color. The whole hall stood frozen, as if everyone sensed that what I was about to say next would split my life, and theirs, into two clean halves. I took a breath, then faced Linda, Evan, and Sophie. Tomorrow, I paused just one beat, we meet with the lawyers. The next morning, Denver carried the kind of early spring cold that cuts across your face like a thin blade. No more snow, but wind sharp enough to sting. I reached attorney Becca Hooper's office 10 minutes early. Evan and Sophie were already in the waiting room, heads lowered. Linda stood by the window, trying to maintain her posture, but I could see her hand trembling, the kind of tremble that comes when panic is spreading from the inside out. When Becca opened the door and invited us into the conference room, no one said a word. The white overhead light shone onto a long wooden table, where 3 thick folders were laid out, each one as heavy as a bound verdict. Becca didn't waste time. She opened the first file and slid it toward Linda. This is the full breakdown of Mr. Porter's assets, categorized according to Colorado's separate property statutes. Linda swallowed hard, and I watched a bead of sweat drop onto the edge of the page. Becca flipped to the next section, her voice clear and entirely emotionless. Mile High Rentals, LLC. 14 properties, all purchased with Raymond's separate income. No spousal contribution, no joint ownership, no marital asset, no claim. Linda's lips tightened, and both Evan and Sophie jerked their heads up like someone had snapped a whip in front of them. Becca went on. Under Colorado divorce law, Mrs. Linda is entitled only to marital assets, acquired jointly during the marriage, and in the Porter household, she paused, then delivered the words like a sentence. She is entitled to split half the equity of the primary house, $21,400, half the remaining savings, $3,500, and the old Subaru Outback. Total, $24,900. That was what remained after subtracting the mortgage and marital expenses. The room thickened with silence. Linda blinked rapidly, her mouth trembling too hard to form sound. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth. Evan leaned back like someone had drained the air from his chest. Becca continued without the slightest trace of sympathy. And because all of Mr. Porter's assets fall under separate property, you may not touch any of the houses, any of the rental income, or any of the LLC accounts. Linda forced out a broken sentence. But I was his wife for the... Becca cut her off instantly. Duration does not create ownership. Contribution does, and you made no financial contribution. Linda froze. Evan stared at the table. Fingers knotted. Sophie started crying. This time not out of embarrassment, but because she realized she and her mother had just crushed their own future. Then the worst blow, at least for Linda, hit. Her phone buzzed. On the screen, Brock, the lover. Linda's hand shook as she opened the message. A single line, "Don't contact me anymore," followed by another, "I don't want to be involved in this, I'm sorry." The way Linda collapsed into her chair looked exactly like a building whose foundation had been kicked out. Sophie broke into louder sobs. Evan pressed a hand to his forehead and whispered, "Oh, God." But the reckoning wasn't done. Evan. Becca shifted her attention to him and opened the second folder. Regarding your medical school financial aid, because your family submitted inaccurate financial information, the school has suspended your aid package. Evan shot to his feet. No, 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 I can't drop out. Becca remained calm. Unless you find a new financial sponsor, that is the likely outcome. Sophie. Becca opened the third folder. As for the grant, Sophie was expecting to open her art studio. The funding was based on the assumption of family marital assets. That assumption is no longer valid. The grant is revoked. Sophie cried harder, covering her face. No, my studio. I looked at them, my two children breaking apart because the man they called useless had been the only person capable of saving their careers. Linda looked at me. Through frantic tears, her voice shredded. Raymond, I made a mistake. And I looked back with the calm of a man who had just placed a period at the end of 35 years of being diminished. Outside, wind hit the windows, rattling the glass. I stood slowly. A mistake is your choice. The consequences are the laws. That afternoon, Denver lay under a thin veil of haze like the last breath of winter. I was making tea in my small kitchen when I heard a knock on the door. Not loud, not urgent, but the kind of knock from someone who had been standing outside for a long time, unsure whether to leave or stay one more moment. When I opened the door, Evan was there. The same face, but no longer the proud medical student he once was. His hair was longer, his eyes darkened from lack of sleep, and his orange Home Depot jacket looked noticeably worn. He tried to smile, but his lips trembled, as if every word he was about to say weighed more than the 5-gallon paint buckets he carried every day. I'm working at Home Depot now, I nodded, not surprised. I'd heard it from Marcus at the union a week ago, but I let Evans say it himself. This wasn't a test. It was responsibility. He swallowed hard, then continued, his voice thick. Dad, my supervisor treats me better than I ever treated you. He said it without raising his head. A simple sentence, yet it tightened the room until silence felt like another presence. I invited him in. Evan stepped in cautiously, almost afraid to disturb the air. He didn't sit right away, just hovered a few seconds before lowering himself into the chair. 5 minutes later, Sophie arrived. 2 soft knocks. When I opened the door, she stood there in an old sweater, hair tied hastily, holding a paper bag from a local bank. I'm repaying the debt, month by month. She opened the bag and pulled out payment receipts, one for every month, all on time. It's the first time in my life I feel proud of myself. I let them sit together. For the first time in months, there was no live stream, no blue TikTok glow, no smug smiles, no Linda behind them directing the family's narrative. Just 3 people, 1 table, and a conversation that should have happened years ago. I didn't hug them, didn't cry, didn't say, I understand, or it's okay. Forgiveness isn't a gift you hand out instantly. It's a process, and it demands real change. I sat across from them, hands clasped. If you think your father will soften just because of what happened, no, I won't. Evan lowered his head. Sophie gripped her sleeve. I continued, steady but not cold. Respect begins with listening, and neither of you listened to me for years. They didn't argue, didn't excuse themselves, didn't shift blame. I looked at them for a long moment, then spelled out each condition, not as punishment, but as boundaries. First, you do not bring up money with me. No asking, no hinting, no circling around it. Evan nodded immediately. Sophie bit her lip and nodded after a long beat. Second, you show respect through action, not words, not apologies. Action. Evan whispered, I understand. Sophie murmured, I will. Third, you must build stable lives on your own. No depending on me, no depending on your mother, no leaning on anyone. They straightened up, as if accepting a vow they knew they must carry. I looked at them and said the final sentence. The sentence a father who loves in the right way has to say, if you can live through these 3 things, then I will open the door. Both Evan and Sophie nodded, not the kind of nod meant to please, but the kind of nod from people who understand they are standing at the threshold of a new life. Then Evan asked, his voice slow and cracked, Dad, when will you forgive us? I looked toward the window where the late afternoon light stretched into the room like a thin band of gold and answered, "When you prove you deserve it." A year passed as quickly as the cold wind slicing through Colfax Avenue on early winter mornings. Denver stayed the same, dry high plains, sunlight sharp as needles, wind cold like ice running through veins. But my family was no longer the family from a year ago. In 12 months, each of my children stepped out from their own shadow and Linda's shadow to rebuild their lives with real bricks, real hands, real sweat. Evan, the boy who once wore a white lab coat but couldn't handle a single humble truth, now wore the gray safety jacket of Edison Electrical. He changed careers, became an Edison technician, a real electrician who stood inside customers' apartments, holding a screwdriver, wiring panels, climbing ladders, fixing circuits. His income was now $78,000 a year, enough for him to pay his own bills, support himself, and stand on his own feet, without needing anyone to pull him up. He once told me, on an afternoon when light snow dusted Lakewood, "Dad, for the first time, I understand what it feels like to earn every dollar with my own hands." I only patted his shoulder, no extra words needed. Sophie changed too, but in a quieter, softer way. No more live streams flaunting designer bags, no more filters smudging her reality, no more empty compliments from strangers. She worked part-time at a cafe, taught art to kids at the community center, saved month by month, and by late autumn she opened a small studio, built entirely by her own effort and her own money, without borrowing from me even once. On opening day she invited me, just a wooden sign painted by hand reading Sophie Porter Art Studio. But I saw more than any fancy billboard, growth, dignity, and for the first time, gratitude. As for Linda, she left the big house in Littleton and moved into a small apartment near Federal. No one pushed her out. No one hated her. Her own lifelong choices simply led her there. The lover left. Friends pulled away. The kids were busy rebuilding themselves. Linda lived quietly, not because she was punished, but because silence was the only thing left to hold on to after the noise of ambition and ego finally abandoned her. I didn't hate her, didn't resent her. I just let everything stand where it truly belonged. And I, Raymond Porter, the man who spent his life being called the old trash man, somehow became a small symbol in the neighborhood. Not the kind with a name in the newspaper, not the kind TV stations chase, but the kind people mention when they see me on the street. He used to pick up trash, but he kept this whole area clean for 35 years. Or when they pass by and pause, smiling, nodding, "Good morning, Ray. Thank you for everything." I didn't need statues, didn't need a tribute article. I just needed to know people finally saw the worth of someone who stood behind this city for 3 decades. Quiet, steady, never asking for credit. One winter morning, Denver greeted the sun with that thin golden light only Colorado skies can create. I stood beside the old garbage truck, the companion that carried me through countless wind-whipped nights, snow piled on the hood, and moments when I thought my heart was freezing like the water in the pipes. I placed my hand on the truck's side, watching the sun rise behind the buildings of the city I had loved in the most silent way, and I said, not loud, not soft, just enough for the wind to carry, "Silence isn't weakness. It's the time it takes for justice to sharpen. And in the end, justice, though late, always finds its way. For 35 years I stood behind this city, quiet as a tree no one notices. But sometimes the quiet ones carry the biggest stories. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Because not everyone has the patience to listen to a life built from sweat, endurance, and a justice that comes slow but comes true. If you want to stay with me for the next chapters, stories of betrayal, awakening, justice, and the silent heroes among us, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Thank you for staying with me to the very last lines. As long as you're still there, I'll keep telling the story.